The penthouse sat 62 floors above Manhattan, a glass and steel monument to everything Ethan Caldwell had built by the age of 33. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York City skyline like a living painting, one that changed colors with the seasons, but never quite warmed the rooms it decorated. The furniture was Italian, the art was original, and the silence was deafening. Ethan stood at the edge of that view every morning with a cup of coffee that cost $14 a bag, watching the city wake up below him like a god observing ants. He had built Caldwell Tech from a two-bedroom apartment in Queens into a $2.7 billion enterprise. Forbes had featured him 3 times. His face had graced the cover of Time magazine under the headline, "The Architect of Tomorrow." Women wanted to be near him, men wanted to be him, and every person in his orbit, from his board of directors to his personal driver, treated him with the reverent, careful energy that surrounded the obscenely wealthy. He told himself he preferred it that way. He had rules. Specific, unwavering rules, not just for his company, but for his personal life. His home was a sanctuary, and the people who entered it existed to maintain order, not to create noise. He had a cleaning service that rotated on Wednesdays and Saturdays, a chef who arrived at precisely 7 each morning and left by 9, and a personal assistant named Derek who communicated with all of them so Ethan never had to. He did not learn the names of service workers. He did not engage in personal conversation. He did not care about their lives, their families, or their problems. He paid well, exceptionally well, in fact, and he considered that the entirety of his social contract with them. His mother, Eleanor, had once told him that wealth without warmth was just a very expensive kind of loneliness. He had smiled at her politely and changed the subject. Eleanor had passed 2 years ago, leaving behind a void he refused to examine too closely and a small photo album he kept in his nightstand drawer but never opened. The latest disruption to his carefully ordered world had begun 3 weeks ago, when his usual cleaning service had sent a replacement. Apparently, the regular team member had a scheduling conflict, and so a woman named Sophia Reyes had appeared at his door on a Wednesday morning with a laminated badge, a cart of supplies, and the quiet, efficient manner of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in other people's lives. He had barely noticed her. That was the point. But then things began to go subtly, inexplicably wrong. His spare guest bathroom, the one on the east wing that he never used, smelled faintly of lavender when he happened to pass it. He noticed because lavender had been his mother's favorite scent. He stood in the hallway for a moment, startled by the sudden tightness in his chest, then walked away without investigating. A week later, he found his coffee table books reorganized. Not chaotically. They had been arranged by color on the spine, a gradient from deep navy to pale gold that was, objectively, more beautiful than the haphazard stacking he'd maintained before. He felt a flicker of something that might have been irritation, but landed somewhere closer to curiosity. Then last week, he had come home early from a board meeting to find a small, crayon drawing sitting on the kitchen counter, tucked carefully under his marble fruit bowl. It was a crude, gloriously colorful rendering of what appeared to be a tall building with a yellow sun behind it, and at the base of the building, 2 tiny stick figures, one very tall, one very small, holding hands. In the corner, written in an adult hand, were the words, "Sorry.
She came with me today.
Emergency. It won't happen again. SR." Ethan had stared at that drawing for a long time. Then he had placed it precisely back under the fruit bowl and called Derek. "Fire her," he said. Derek had paused on the other end of the line. "Sir, she's only been assigned 3 times. Her reviews from previous clients are exceptional. Are you sure you want?" "I don't want children in my home, Derek. I want it done by morning." Derek had said yes, of course, because Derek always said yes, and Ethan had gone to bed feeling entirely righteous and not at all troubled by the image of those two little crayon stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. He was a man with rules. Rules kept things clean. Rules kept things safe. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Learned it in a childhood where things had been anything but safe, where his father's moods were unpredictable and his mother's tears were frequent, and where a very small version of Ethan Caldwell had decided that control was the only real protection a person could build around themselves. He had taken that lesson and turned it into an empire. He had taken it and lined it with marble floors and Italian furniture and 62 floors of altitude. He never asked himself what he was protecting anymore. He just kept building the walls higher. The next morning, he woke at 5:30 as always, made his coffee because the chef didn't arrive until 7, and sat in the pale gray pre-dawn light of his kitchen with his phone in his hand. Derek had texted at 11 the previous night. Done. Termination notice sent to the agency. Sofia Reyes will not be assigned to your residence again. Ethan read the message, set the phone face down on the counter, and looked at the fruit bowl. The drawing was still there. He didn't know why he hadn't thrown it away. He told himself it was simply because he hadn't gotten around to it. He pulled it out and held it under the kitchen light, studying the clumsy crayon lines, the enthusiastic yellow sun that took up a full quarter of the page, the two stick figures with their wide circular heads and their tiny outstretched arms reaching for each other. There was something about the drawing, something in the unself-conscious joy of it, the unashamed tenderness of those two figures reaching toward each other, that made the tightness return to his chest, that same tightness the lavender had triggered, the one he associated with things he kept locked in a nightstand drawer and refused to look at. He turned the page over. On the back, he noticed something he had missed before, a smaller note, written in the same careful adult handwriting, but this one clearly added after the first apology, as if the writer had turned the page over on impulse. She insisted on leaving this for the tall man who lives in the sky. She said he looked lonely from the window when we pulled up. 3-year-olds see things grown-ups miss. I'm sorry for any inconvenience we caused you, Mr. Caldwell. Truly. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. He looked lonely from the window. He set the drawing down slowly, picked up his phone, and before Derek's termination notice could be processed by the agency, he did something he almost never did. He dialed the number directly himself. He told himself he was calling to clarify the termination terms. He was not ready, not even slightly, for who answered the phone. The phone rang 4 times, which already annoyed him. People in service industries answered quickly. That was the baseline expectation. By the 3rd ring, Ethan had already mentally composed the brief, professional message he would leave, the one that would confirm the termination without requiring any actual human interaction. He was good at those. He had perfected the art of communicating consequence without communicating care. Then the 5th ring cut off abruptly, and he heard breathing. Small breathing. Uncertain breathing. The kind that belonged to someone who had never held a phone before and wasn't entirely sure which end to speak into. Huo. Ethan blinked. The voice was tiny. Not small in the way adult voices could be quiet or hesitant, but genuinely, physically tiny, the way only very young children's voices were, as if the sound itself was miniature. It was soft and round at the edges, with that particular toddler quality that turned every consonant into something slightly melted, slightly magical. "Hello," he said, automatically. "Huo." The voice brightened immediately, delighted to have gotten a response, as if she had not been entirely certain that the strange, glowing rectangle would talk back. "Who you?" Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. This had never happened to him before in any professional context or any context at all, really. He was a man who controlled boardrooms, who had negotiated nine-figure acquisitions without breaking a sweat, who had once talked a famously volatile tech investor off a metaphorical ledge with nothing but calm authority and precise language. And he was completely, utterly unprepared for this. He started. Is your mother available? Mama's crying, the little voice said, with the matter-of-fact gravity that only toddlers could achieve, delivering devastating information with the same casual tone one might use to report that it was raining outside. The words landed on Ethan's chest like something physical. She's crying? MHM.
A pause.
He could hear small movements, the rustling of fabric, what sounded like the sticky noise of small fingers exploring the phone screen. She got a letter. She read it and then she cried. I gave her my bunny, but she's still sad. Another pause, filled with the particular solemnity of a child reporting very serious events. My bunny always makes me feel better. Ethan stood absolutely still in his kitchen. The morning light had shifted from gray to the pale gold of early sunrise, and it fell across the crayon drawing still sitting on his counter.
He looked at it.
The tall man in the sky and the small figure beside him, arms outstretched. What's your name? He heard himself ask. He didn't know why he asked it. It wasn't relevant. It wasn't why he'd called. Lila, the tiny voice announced, with the full confidence of someone who considered their name to be the most important fact in the world. Lila Rose Ways. I'm free.
A beat.
How old are you? He almost didn't answer. 33 years old, a billionaire, and a 3-year-old had just asked him his age with the casual authority of someone conducting an interview. 33. Oh, Lila said thoughtfully. That's really old. Something strange happened to Ethan Caldwell's face. It had been so long since it happened that it took him a moment to identify the sensation. The corner of his mouth moved.
Just barely.
Just for a fraction of a second.
But it moved.
Yes, he said. I suppose it is. I'm free, Lila repeated, apparently feeling this was the superior position. Do you have a dog?
No.
We don't have a dog, Ifo, she confided. Mama says, maybe someday. I want a big one. With floppy ears. The phone rustled again, and then, in a slightly different acoustic, closer, as if she had pressed the phone harder against her face, she whispered, Are you the man Mama works for? The one in the tall building? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I drawed you a picture, Lila said, her voice lighting up with pride. Did you get it? I used the blue and the yellow and the red. Red is my favorite. Red, he said softly. I got the picture. Do you like it? He looked at the drawing again. The two stick figures reaching for each other under a sun so enthusiastically colored it had gone slightly outside the lines. Something in his throat felt oddly constricted. Yes, he said. I do. Good. She seemed genuinely satisfied by this. There was a pause, filled with the background sounds of a small apartment, a television at low volume somewhere, the distant sound of traffic, what might have been a kettle. Mama cried because of the letter, Lila said again, circling back with a child's unerring instinct for the important thing. She thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. I saw her at the table. The tiny voice dropped, became quieter, became something more fragile underneath its brightness. Mama doesn't CWI a lot. She's very brave. But when she does, I don't know how to make it better except for my bunny, and sometimes my bunny doesn't work. Ethan closed his eyes. He had written 1,000 strategic memos. He had crafted responses to crises, PR disasters, market crashes, hostile takeovers. He had never in his life felt as thoroughly and completely disarmed as he did at this moment, standing in his 62-floor kitchen with the sunrise coming through the windows, listening to a 3-year-old tell him her mother was crying and her bunny wasn't working. He had sent that letter. He had told Derek to send it, which was the same thing. "Lila," he said carefully, "can you go get your mama for me, please?" Another pause. "Are you gonna make her more sad?" The question was utterly direct and completely devastating, the way only a small child who loved someone very much could make a question both devastatingly simple and profoundly moral. Ethan felt it like a physical sensation, like standing too close to the edge of something very high. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not going to make her more sad." Lila considered this with audible seriousness. He could almost hear her thinking, the careful deliberation of a very small person making a very important decision. "Okay," she said finally, "but if you do, I'm going to be very angry." "That's fair," Ethan said. He heard the phone being set down with a loud clunk on what sounded like a hard surface. Then small footsteps, quick, light, pattering footsteps, and then a child's voice calling out at full, uninhibited volume. "Mama, Mama, the phone. The man from the tall building wants you, and he says he's not gonna make you cry. Mama." Ethan heard, distantly, a sound that might have been a sharp intake of breath. Then more footsteps, heavier, hurried. The sound of something being knocked over gently. And then silence for a moment, the particular silence of someone picking up a phone and trying to compose themselves before they speak. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was careful and controlled, but there was a roughness underneath it, the texture that voices get when they have been crying, and the crying hasn't finished yet, just been temporarily suspended.
"I'm so sorry about that."
She got to the phone before I. "Ms. Reyes," he interrupted and then stopped. He had planned words for this call. Professional words. Termination language. He had planned to be crisp and clear and to leave no room for anything messy or human or complicated. But a 3-year-old had answered the phone and told him her bunny wasn't working. And somewhere underneath 62 floors of carefully constructed altitude, something in Ethan Caldwell had shifted. "I'd like to meet with you," he said. "Tomorrow morning. My office." Not, he paused, to discuss the termination. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. "Then what for?" she asked, with a quiet directness that reminded him, startlingly, of her daughter. He looked at the crayon drawing one more time. The tall man in the sky. The small figure reaching upward. "To discuss," he said slowly, "a different arrangement." He hung up before she could respond, then stood in his golden morning kitchen wondering what on earth had just happened to him. He picked up the drawing and, instead of placing it back under the fruit bowl, walked to the refrigerator. He found a small magnet, one he'd never used, one that had been there when he bought the place, and he pressed the drawing to the stainless steel door. It looked entirely out of place against the sleek, expensive appliance. It was the most alive thing in the apartment. Sophia Reyes had learned, by 28, to make herself small. Not in spirit. Her spirit was something she had fought hard to keep intact, something she guarded with the fierce, quiet intensity of a woman who understood that it was the one thing that truly belonged to her and could not be taken away. But in presence, in posture, in the careful, practiced art of moving through wealthy spaces without disturbing them, without suggesting that she had needs or a story or a life that extended beyond the service she was providing. She had been doing it since she was 15, when she had come with her mother to clean houses in the suburbs of New Jersey, learning the code by osmosis. The downcast eyes when a homeowner came through, the soft footsteps, the way you learned which rooms felt like territories and which felt like they might allow you to breathe. Her mother, Carmen, had called it invisible grace. The art of being present and absent at the same time. It kept you employed. It kept things comfortable for everyone. What her mother hadn't taught her, what she'd had to learn herself in the brutal graduate school of single parenthood, was how to maintain invisible grace while simultaneously being the loudest, most ferociously visible presence in the world for a small person who depended on you entirely. How to be quiet in someone else's space and enormous in your own. How to fold yourself down in the morning and then come home in the evening and let Lila climb into your lap and expand back into your full size, your full self. All of it called back by the simple gravitational force of your child's absolute faith in you. Lila Rose Reyes had arrived in the world 3 years ago during a February ice storm, 6 days early, screaming with the full conviction of someone who had places to be and things to say. Her father, Marco, had been gone by the time she was 3 months old. Not dramatically, not with a scene, but with a gradual disappearance that was somehow worse for its quietness. One day he was there, and then there were longer absences, and then one morning Sophia woke to find a note and an empty closet, and she had sat on the edge of their bed for 20 minutes, allowing herself to feel the full, crushing weight of it before she got up, went into Lila's room, lifted her daughter from the crib, held her close enough to feel the perfect warm weight of her, and made a decision.
She would not be broken by this.
She would not let the breaking reach Lila. She had rebuilt their life with the methodical, unglamorous determination of someone who doesn't have the luxury of despair. She moved to a smaller apartment in the Bronx. She expanded her client list, took on extra shifts, learned to time Lila's naps to her scheduling gaps. Her neighbor, Mrs. Okonkwo, a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher with grandchildren of her own, had become their village, watching Lila on the days Sophia's schedule didn't permit a gap, accepting payments when she could and declining them when she couldn't, and providing the particular, irreplaceable gift of being a person who loved Lila simply because Lila was lovable. The Caldwell account had been a step up, a significant one. The pay rate was 40% higher than her standard assignments, and the work itself was straightforward, a meticulous but largely empty space that required care rather than heavy labor. She had taken it seriously, as she took everything seriously, and she had been doing well. Until the Wednesday, when Mrs. Okonkwo had a doctor's appointment that ran long and couldn't be rescheduled, and the backup childcare option had fallen through, and Sophia had made the desperate calculation that she would bring Lila, keep her confined to the cleaning cart area, finish in 3 hours, and be gone before anyone was the wiser. It would have worked. Lila was, by Toddler standards, remarkably well-behaved in strange spaces. Her particular personality leaned toward observation and study rather than destruction. She had sat in her stroller for nearly 2 hours, watching her mother work with the focused attention of a small scientist, asking occasional whispered questions. What is that for? Why is that so shiny? Does the tall man have a dog? I can't see a dog. And then, during the final stretch, boredom had defeated her, and she had found a crayon in her stroller's cup holder and a blank page in her small activity pad, and she had done what Lila always did when feelings became too large for her body. She had drawn them. Sophia had found the picture after the fact and made the decision to leave it with a note rather than simply pocket it and say nothing. She believed, perhaps inconveniently, in honesty, even when honesty was risky, even when it would have been so much easier to simply disappear. So she had turned the page over and added the second note, the one about the window, the one about Lila seeing what grown-ups missed, and she had carried a quiet thread of anxiety about it for days afterward. The termination letter had arrived by email at 9:47 the previous night. She had been at the kitchen table after putting Lila to bed, going through her monthly expenses with the grim arithmetic of someone always calculating how much margin there was between okay and not okay. She had read the letter twice. It was professionally worded and said nothing personal, the agency's boilerplate for client-requested reassignment. But between its careful lines was the simple, clear fact: she had broken a rule, and it had cost her one of her highest-paying accounts. She had sat there for a moment, very still, in the quiet apartment with Lila's soft breathing just barely audible through the bedroom door. Then she had put her face in her hands. She had not, in the 3 years of holding everything together by will alone, allowed herself to cry very often. But that night, in that kitchen, the weight of all the narrow margins and the constant calculation and the years of making herself invisible so she could remain employed, all of it landed at once. She cried quietly, carefully, the way she did everything, trying not to wake Lila. She had not succeeded. She had found her daughter standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with a small stuffed rabbit that went everywhere with her dark eyes wide and serious, her hair a magnificent disaster of sleep. "Mama," Lila had said, with grave toddler authority, "you need my bunny." Sophia had pulled her daughter into her arms and held her in the kitchen in the dark for a long time, and Lila had held the bunny pressed between them, and neither of them had said anything else. And then morning had come, and the phone had rung, and Lila had gotten to it first, because Lila always got to things first. That was simply the nature of Lila, and Sophia had come running from the bedroom to find her daughter in the middle of an apparently comfortable phone conversation with the man who had just fired her. She stood now in her small kitchen after the call, the phone in both hands, reading the address Derek had texted as a follow-up. His office. Tomorrow morning. Not to discuss the termination. She read the message 4 times, turned it over in her mind, and could not decipher what it meant. "Mama," Lila said from the floor, where she was arranging her collection of small plastic animals into what appeared to be a very specific social hierarchy. The tall man seemed nice. Sophia looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "my picture was good." Lila looked up with satisfaction. "I told you the wed was the right choice." Sophia sat down on the floor beside her daughter, crossed her legs, and picked up a small plastic giraffe. She turned it over in her hands. "Lila," she said quietly, "what exactly did you two talk about?" Lila considered this with the retrospective thoughtfulness of someone reviewing an important meeting.
"Dogs," she said.
"And how old he is?" "He's very old, Mama. He's 33. Sophia pressed her lips together. "And," Lila added, placing a plastic elephant with decisive authority at the head of her animal formation, "I told him if he made you cry, I was going to be very angry." Sophia looked at her daughter. This small, fierce, completely unarmored person who moved through the world with her heart entirely on the outside, who gave her bunny to sad people and drew pictures for lonely strangers and issued warnings to billionaires without a moment's hesitation. She pulled Lila into her side, pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's chaotic hair, and held on. "I don't know what tomorrow is," she murmured, mostly to herself. Lila patted her arm with the practical comfort of someone who had been through harder things. "It's okay, Mama. I'll be here." The Caldwell Tech headquarters occupied floors 40 through 55 of a midtown tower, and the executive floor carried the particular atmosphere of extreme wealth presented as extreme restraint, clean lines, neutral tones, an aggressively curated absence of anything that might suggest warmth or messiness, or any of the other qualities that made life human. Sophia arrived 14 minutes early. She had dressed carefully, without performing, a clean navy blazer she'd bought 2 years ago for a different important meeting, dark trousers pressed the night before while Lila slept, shoes polished until the leather reflected light. She had done her hair neatly and applied just enough of the simple makeup she owned to communicate that she took herself seriously. She had left Lila with Mrs. Okonkwo, who had squeezed her hand at the door and said, "You go in there like you belong," And Sophia had carried that instruction the entire train ride uptown, repeating it quietly to herself like a prayer. The receptionist at the executive floor looked surprised to see her. Not rudely so. She recovered quickly. But the flicker was there, the brief recalibration of expectation. Sophia was used to that flicker. She had learned not to let it land. "Sophia Reyes," she said clearly. "I have a 9 o'clock with Mr. Caldwell." She was shown to a chair and offered coffee, which she declined, and she sat for 7 minutes in the immaculate waiting area and studied her breathing and looked at the city through the enormous windows and thought about the crayon drawing and about Lila's voice on the phone. He looks lonely from the window, and she thought about the second note she had written, the one she almost hadn't included, the one where she had let herself be visible for one unguarded moment. She had not expected it to matter. She had expected, at most, to be ignored. She had not expected a phone call. Ethan Caldwell appeared in the doorway of his office at precisely 9 o'clock because he was a man who was precise about things, and Sophia stood, and they looked at each other across the 10 feet of neutral carpeting. She had seen him in passing, those 3 Wednesdays, a tall figure in a dark suit who moved through his own home, like a man navigating a space he owned but did not inhabit. She had registered him the way you registered whether relevant, distant, not to be engaged with. She had not let herself look directly, and he had not looked at all. He looked now. He was taller than she'd registered, and younger looking than the photographs in the financial magazines in the waiting area, which made him somehow more difficult to read. She had prepared on the train ride for the particular subspecies of wealthy man who used height and silence as control mechanisms. She had met that type often enough to have a strategy for it. But Ethan Caldwell's face, in this unguarded first moment before professional masks snapped back into place, held something she hadn't anticipated. He looked, she thought, like someone who wasn't entirely sure why he had made this appointment. He looked, just for a fraction of a second, like someone who had possibly surprised himself. "Ms. Reyes," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," she said, with the neutrally professional courtesy she'd perfected over years. He stepped back and gestured toward his office, and she walked in. It was enormous and ordered, and full of the kind of expensive objects that communicated authority without warmth. But on his desk, and she noticed this immediately because she noticed everything in rooms she was responsible for, there was a slightly out-of-place item. A piece of paper, folded once, set to the side of his keyboard with a precision that suggested it had been placed there deliberately. She recognized it by the edge of yellow crayon visible at the fold. He had brought the drawing to his office. She sat in the chair across from his desk and said nothing about it, and he sat down and opened a folder and said nothing about it either, and for a moment they were both exquisitely aware of the small square of crayon paper sitting between them like a small, colorful fact that neither of them was ready to name. "I've reviewed your file," he began, and his voice had slipped into the register of professional competence, measured, uninflected. "Your work reviews from every client account are exceptional. In the 12 months you've been with the agency, you've maintained a 5-point rating." "Yes," Sophia said. "The reason for the termination was the presence of your child in my home without prior notification or consent." "Yes," she said again. "I understand that. I should have called ahead. I didn't, and that was my error. I'm not here to argue it." Something shifted slightly in his expression. She had the impression that he had prepared for argument and wasn't entirely sure what to do with its absence. "What I want to understand," he said, setting the folder down, "is why. You have an exceptional record. The risk to your account was significant. So what happened?" Sophia considered the question. She could give him the practical answer: the scheduling collapse, the backup failure, the arithmetic of a single parent with no safety net. That answer was true. But she had read the second note after she'd written it and known that she had chosen in that moment to be honest about more than logistics. My childcare fell through at the last minute, she said. I had no one. The appointment was my highest paying account, and I can't afford to cancel without cause.
She paused.
So I brought her, and I tried to be careful, and I didn't tell you, because I knew it was against protocol, and I was hoping you would notice. And then Lila drew that picture, and I made the decision to be honest about it rather than pretend it hadn't happened. She held his gaze steadily. That's all of it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The second note. The one on the back. Yes. You said she saw something from the window. She said you looked lonely. Sophia said it plainly, without inflection, neither apologizing for it nor weaponizing it. I wrote it because I meant it as an explanation of why she drew what she drew, not as anything else. He looked at the folded paper on his desk. She told me her bunny always makes her feel better. Sophia blinked. This was not a conversational direction she had anticipated from an executive boardroom debriefing. It's a very important bunny, she said carefully. She also told me I was very old. Sophia closed her eyes briefly. I am so sorry. She seemed to consider 33 a significant achievement in aging. His voice had changed very slightly, but she caught it. The professional register had loosened by some small degree. She mentioned she is 3. She reminds people of that frequently, Sophia said. She considers it significant information. She told me, Ethan said slowly, that if I made you cry, she would be very angry. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the city hummed and moved and continued its perpetual indifferent business, 60 floors below. Sophia held herself steady against the sudden, treacherous warmth she felt at hearing that reported. The image of her daughter, 3 years old and fully certain of her authority, issuing protective warnings to a stranger on the phone. She would be, Sophia said softly. She's very fierce. Ethan nodded once, as if filing this information. Then he straightened slightly and shifted the register back. I'm reinstating your account, he said. With conditions. Sophia stared at him. The conditions are these, he continued, opening the folder again. You'll have a dedicated time slot, Tuesdays and Fridays, 10 to 1. The pay rate will be increased by 30%. He paused. And if your childcare falls through, you may bring your daughter. I'll have a small space set up in the East Wing. There's a sitting room that's unused. It can have appropriate furniture. The silence stretched. Mr. Caldwell, Sophia said quietly. Why? He looked up from the folder. For a moment, the professional composure had nowhere to go, and the man underneath it was briefly, uncomfortably visible, uncertain and searching and trying to reconstruct a wall that had developed, overnight, an inexplicable crack in it. I had rules, he said. About service staff. About personal engagement. He paused. Your daughter told me he looked lonely from the window. Another pause. I've been thinking about it since. Sophia looked at him across the wide, ordered desk, and she saw it then. The things she had seen in rooms for years, the things she noticed in spaces and never in people, the things she had been too busy being invisible to look for. He was asking, in the language available to a man who had never learned softer ones, for something he did not have a word for. She picked up the folder. Okay, she said.
Yes.
I'll take the new terms. Ethan Caldwell nodded and looked back at his desk, and the small folded crayon drawing sat between them in the morning light. The sitting room in the East Wing had, within 2 Tuesdays, been entirely colonized. It was not an aggressive colonization. It was the inevitable and cheerful kind that small children perform simply by occupying a space with their full personality, which in Lila's case meant that the room, which Ethan had furnished with a small table and 2 child-appropriate chairs, and a bookshelf of picture books sourced by Derek with characteristic efficiency, had also accrued. One additional stuffed bunny serving as backup to the primary bunny, a collection of 17 crayon colors, arranged in a very specific order that only Lila understood. A blanket brought from home that was neon green and deeply beloved, the plastic animal hierarchy, and a banner made of construction paper that read, in Lila's assisted printing, Lila's room, with a large yellow sun. The banner had been taped to the doorframe with what appeared to be an entire roll of washi tape. Ethan had walked past it on the first Tuesday it appeared and stopped and stared at it for a moment, and then walked on without removing it. It was still there. What had not been anticipated, what Ethan had not factored into the conditional arrangement with its professional language and its structured time slots, was that Lila Rose Reyes did not stay in designated spaces. Not because she was disobedient, exactly, but because the world was interesting to her in all directions simultaneously, and staying in one room when there was an entire apartment full of surfaces and textures and objects to investigate was a proposition that made no sense to a 3-year-old operating on pure scientific curiosity. Sophia had established boundaries. Lila had acknowledged them with the complete sincerity of someone who intended to honor them right up until the moment something more interesting appeared. The first incursion had happened on day 3, when Ethan had come home earlier than expected. A meeting had canceled, a rare gift of unstructured time he hadn't known what to do with, and walked into his kitchen to find Lila sitting on the counter beside the fruit bowl, having apparently climbed up there via the lower cabinet handles, eating a green grape with the serene confidence of someone for whom property rights were a flexible concept. She had looked at him with wide, dark, utterly unafraid eyes. "Huo," she said. He had stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Huo," he said back, automatically. "I found the grapes," she informed him. "They're good." She held one out toward him with the generous hospitality of someone sharing their own personal discovery. "You want one?" Sophia appeared in the doorway behind him approximately 8 seconds later, flushed and out of breath, radiating the particular energy of a parent who has just discovered their child is not where they left them. "Lila Rose Reyes, we talked about." She stopped when she saw Ethan. The color in her face rearranged itself. "I am so sorry." She was in the sitting room and then she found the grapes, Ethan said. "I can see that." A small hand was still extended toward him, offering the grape with patient toddler charity. He took it. He ate it. Lila beamed at him as if he had just passed the most important test of his life. "They're good, White," she said triumphantly. "They are," he said. Sophia had removed Lila from the counter and returned her firmly to the East Wing with a very serious discussion about boundaries. But Ethan had stood in his kitchen for a moment after they left and felt the lingering warmth of that small transaction. The grape, the smile, the uncomplicated human simplicity of a child offering what she had found because sharing good things was, to Lila, simply the obvious thing to do. He had not, in a very long time, had anyone offer him something for no reason at all. After that, the boundary enforcement became, on both sides, somewhat theoretical. Ethan found himself working from home more frequently on Tuesdays and Fridays. He told himself this was because he had projects that required concentration. He worked in his study, which happened to be at the end of the hallway nearest the East Wing. And sometimes, not every time and not formally, the door would open and small footsteps would appear and Lila would arrive with a crayon drawing or a question or a story about the plastic animals, delivered with the unassuming confidence of someone who had decided, on her own independent authority, that he was a person worth knowing. He had learned that the bunny was named Gerald. He had learned that Lila's favorite color was red, but that she thought orange was exciting. He had learned that she was afraid of the sound of trucks at night, but not of anything else, because as she had explained with simple toddler logic, trucks were very loud, and loud was scary, but spiders were small, and small was fine. He had learned that she called him the tall man even now, even in person, with affectionate specificity. He had learned that she asked about his mother, once, when she saw the photo album on his nightstand through the open bedroom door while investigating. "Who's that?" she had asked, pointing at a photograph visible through the cover. He had said, "My mother." And Lila had said, with a complete absence of self-consciousness that was her particular gift, "She has a nice face. Is she far away?" And Ethan had said, quietly, "Yes, she's very far away." And Lila had looked at him with those dark, clear eyes and said, "That's sad. Do you want me to draw her a picture, so she knows you think about her?" He had said yes. Not to avoid the conversation, not to redirect a 3-year-old, but because the offer had bypassed every defense he had and arrived somewhere he hadn't known was still open. Lila had sat on the floor outside his bedroom with her red crayon and made a picture of what she described as your mama in a nice place with flowers and a big sun, and she had handed it to him with the gravity of someone performing an important service. He had put it next to the photo in the nightstand drawer. He had not opened the drawer in 2 years. He opened it that evening, after they had gone home, and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his mother's face for a long time. Sophia, for her part, was trying very hard to maintain the careful professional boundaries she had brought with her into this arrangement, and finding it increasingly difficult to locate. It wasn't that Ethan had changed dramatically. He was still precise, still controlled, still moved through his spaces with the considered authority of someone who had never not been in charge. But there were things she noticed now that the invisibility was gone, small things, the kind of things you only saw when you were allowed to look. The way he had quietly researched child-friendly grape varieties after the counter incident and replaced the fruit bowl contents without comment. The way Gerald the bunny had appeared one morning on the East Wing's dedicated shelf with a small hand-sewn patch on the ear that had been wearing thin, repaired so neatly it was barely visible. He had not said anything about it. She had not either. The way he sometimes stopped in the hallway when Lila was telling him something, and his whole body adjusted. This tall, composed, carefully armored man actually bending down to be level with a 3-year-old, giving her the absolute focused attention of someone who had learned, slowly, that small people said important things. Sophia stood in his kitchen one Friday afternoon packing up her supplies and watched him through the doorway, watched Lila pull him toward the East Wing by 2 fingers to show him the newest arrangement of the plastic animal hierarchy, and watched him follow, because Lila pulled and he went, as naturally and inevitably as weather. She thought, "This is dangerous territory." She thought, "I am a single mother who cleans this man's apartment, and he is a billionaire who could end this arrangement with a phone call." She thought, "Lila has already decided." She thought, "So have I, and that is the most terrifying part." It was a Friday in April when everything that had been growing quietly in the spaces between professional and personal finally came fully, irreversibly into the light. Ethan had been on a call for 3 hours, a board meeting gone sideways, the kind of operational crisis that required the full deployment of every skill he had spent his adult life building. He had handled it. He always handled it. But when the call ended and the adrenaline receded, he sat at his desk in the particular emptiness that followed those kinds of days, the aftermath of high-stakes performance, the vacuum that formed when the immediate crisis was resolved and there was nothing left to be competent at. It was the kind of emptiness he had realized lately that had once defined his entire existence. He heard the East Wing door open and then small footsteps, and then the knock on his study door, 3 small, deliberate knocks, because Lila had been practicing knocking and took it seriously.
"Come in," he said.
The door opened and Lila stood in it with Gerald under one arm and an expression of considerable gravity on her 3-year-old face. She was wearing, he noted, a small dress with painted flowers and both shoes, which was a relatively formal presentation for her. She came in and climbed onto the chair across from his desk, a significant athletic undertaking that she accomplished with the dignity of someone refusing assistance, and sat with her feet dangling and looked at him. "Mama's crying again," she said. Ethan went still. "What?" "In the hallway bathroom. She thought I was asleep." Lila held Gerald more tightly. "She does that sometimes. When she thinks I don't know." Dark eyes regarded him with ancient, unwavering seriousness. "But I always know." He was out of the chair before he had consciously decided to move. "Lila, stay here," he said, and she nodded with the gravity of someone accepting an important assignment. He found Sophia in the hallway bathroom, the East Wing bathroom, the one that smelled of lavender, the one he had never used. The door was mostly closed, not fully latched, and he heard, through it, the quiet and controlled sound of someone crying in the way Sophia did everything, with discipline, with effort to minimize the footprint, with the practiced restraint of a woman who had never had the luxury of falling apart freely. He put his hand on the door. He did not go in because he was a man who understood, finally, the difference between the moment to act and the moment to be present. "Sophia," he said quietly. Silence. Then a sharp, steadying breath. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice had that roughness again, the one he knew now. "You don't have to be," he said. A longer silence. He waited. He had learned, these past weeks, the value of simply waiting, of not filling the space, not fixing the silence, not turning every vulnerability into a problem to be managed. He had learned this from a 3-year-old who brought her bunny to sad people and asked nothing in return. The door opened. Sophia stood in the bathroom doorway with her eyes red and her composure assembled back into place, but incompletely. There were gaps in it, places where the realness showed through, and she was too tired today to mortar them all shut. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "The agency called," she said. "I've been offered a full-time position. Facilities management for a midtown hotel. Benefits. Consistent hours. Child care stipend." She looked at the wall, not at him. "It's everything I've been working toward. The kind of stable that Lila deserves." "That's good," he said carefully. "It would mean ending this arrangement." Her jaw was steady. "I needed a minute. That's all. I'm sorry if Lila—" "Sophia," he said. She stopped. He had been practicing, in the privacy of his own increasingly unfamiliar heart, what honesty looked like when it wasn't transactional. He had been practicing it the way he'd once practiced business negotiations, taking it out, examining it, putting it back, approaching it from different angles. He had been practicing it since a 3-year-old had told him he looked lonely from the window, since a drawing had appeared on his refrigerator, since he had found himself bending down to be level with small people because they were worth listening to. "I hired you back," he said, "because of a crayon drawing. I told myself it was because your work record was excellent. That was true. But it wasn't why." He looked at her steadily. "I called that number because I'd had it in my kitchen for 12 hours and I couldn't stop looking at it. I called it because your daughter drew me a picture of a lonely man in a tall building, and it was the most accurate thing anyone had produced about me in 10 years, and I didn't know what to do with that." Sophia looked at him. The composure had gone somewhere else entirely. "I have spent," he said slowly, "a very long time being very good at being alone. I made the walls high enough that I forgot they were walls. I called them preferences, efficiency, rules." He paused. And then a 3-year-old answered a phone and offered me a grape and fixed a bunny's ear in my imagination and made me open a drawer I hadn't opened in 2 years. Sophia pressed her lips together. Her eyes were very bright. I'm not asking you to make a decision based on anything except what's best for you and for Lila, he said. But I'm asking you to know that when I say I don't want this arrangement to end, I mean he stopped. Found the word. Both of you. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere in the study, Lila had apparently grown impatient with being given an assignment and was audible now, talking to Gerald in the low, serious tones of someone consulting an important advisor. Sophia laughed, a real laugh, sudden and undefended, the kind that surprised her. She's going to tell Gerald everything you just said, she said softly. Gerald seems trustworthy, Ethan said. He is. She looked up at him with clear, searching eyes that had spent years looking at spaces carefully and now, for the first time, were looking at a person with the same attention. This is very complicated, what you're describing. I know. I have a daughter, and I have a life that isn't easy, and I've spent a long time making sure no one's chaos gets inside the walls I've built for us. She held his gaze. I built them too. I know, he said again. But I think, and here he looked for just a moment, entirely unsure of himself in the most human way, I think that maybe some walls were built to keep things out that were actually worth letting in. Another silence. A long one. Lila's voice drifted down the hallway, counseling Gerald on what appeared to be a matter of grave stuffed animal diplomacy. Sophia looked toward the sound of her daughter. Then she looked back at Ethan. The hotel job, she said slowly. I told him I'd give my answer by Monday. Okay, he said. I want to think about it. Okay. You should know, she said quietly, that Lila drew you 7 pictures last week. She doesn't draw 7 pictures for just anyone. Something in his face moved. Something that had been locked very tight and was learning, tentatively, the language of opening. I know, he said. She left 6 of them under the fruit bowl and put one on the refrigerator herself. Sophia blinked. She reached the refrigerator? She appears to have used Gerald as a step stool. A pause. I didn't mention it because Gerald seemed to have survived the experience. This time they both laughed, simultaneously, naturally, in the lavender-scented hallway, 62 floors above a city that continued its indifferent business below them. And in that laugh was something that had no professional category, no contract language, no ordered arrangement, something that had been built quietly and patiently and with complete unconscious genius by a 3-year-old who drew pictures for lonely strangers and offered grapes and brought her bunny to sad people and saw, from a window, what grown-ups worked very hard not to see. When they came into the study, Lila was sitting on the floor with Gerald, conducting what appeared to be a formal review. She looked up when they came in together, and her face produced, instantly, the enormous unguarded smile she gave to everything she loved. Tall man, she announced, Gerald says you can stay. Ethan Caldwell looked at this 3-year-old who had dismantled, in 6 weeks and with crayons, what he had spent 33 years constructing. He felt the impossible, specific warmth of being accepted by something small and true, and without agenda. He sat down on the floor. He could not remember the last time he had sat on a floor. Thank you, Gerald, he said, with complete seriousness. Lila beamed and handed him the red crayon, her favorite, the one she shared with no one, and said, with absolute and uncomplicated love, you can use the wed today. Sophia stood in the doorway of a study that looked, for the first time, like a room where someone actually lived, and watched a billionaire accept a crayon from her daughter like it was the most important gift he'd ever been given. Maybe, she thought, for him it was. Outside, the April sun was doing something extravagant with the city skyline, turning every glass surface gold, making the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful city look, just for that moment, just in that light, like something a 3-year-old might draw, bright and warm and full of figures reaching toward each other under a generous yellow sun. Some things, it turns out, can only be built by someone who doesn't yet know they're impossible. Some walls can only be opened by someone too young to know they were meant to stay closed. And some lonely men in tall buildings only learn to come down when a small voice from the ground, brave and fierce and entirely unafraid, looks up and simply says, "Huo." For every child who sees clearly what grown-ups have learned not to look at, and loves anyway, without condition, without strategy, without walls. And for every person who is lonely enough and lucky enough to be seen.